Nutrition Month at NASM, and that means you can get one free nutrition course each week in March. Click the link in the description for details.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's Master Instructor Roundtable. I am Master Instructor Marty Miller here with my good friend, fellow Master Instructor, Miss Wendy Batts. How are you?
I'm great, Marty. How are you?
Awesome. I'm excited. Today is part one, and we are going to take a deep dive into the hip complex.
Yes. We have taken different body parts and broken it up, and this is a big one that because of the freedom that the hip can have and all the muscles and all the attachments and everything sometimes confuses people. And so I'm excited this is going to be one of three. So we hope you guys attend the next two after this one to learn more and to really dig into the hip complex. Let's see how it goes.
It's going to go amazing, Wendy. What do you mean?
Always. With you, Marty, I feel comfortable.
We do our homework, right?
So, Absolutely.
I'm excited for this because I really think that when we look at movement dysfunction, people kind of look at the core and the lumbar hip complex, but man, the hip does so much. And this is why we're going to talk about this. And hopefully over the course of the three different Master Instructor Roundtables, we can really just, explore things and give people a true understanding of how important that hip is.
Absolutely. And I think that's, when you look at the breakdown of what we're going to talk about, we are going to dive deep into the importance of the hip. And not just, we're showing a picture of a player, but, you want to think about just everyday life. And of course, with us being being in a seated position more with all the common compensations that we see, obviously the hip plays an important role that we really want to focus on that because it really does. It's kind of our powerhouse. We need the glutes to fire the right way. We need the hip flexors to be in ideal positioning in order to execute some at the highest level, no matter if they're a professional athlete or a mom. We all need to be able to move our hips. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some anatomy. Of course, we're not going to dive deep into every origin and insertion, but really kind of dig into the importance of certain muscles in particular. And of course, we're going to talk about assessments. Assessing the hip is important. You want to see what compensations are there because that will help in your programming. And then as always, we need a plan of action. We need to know what to do with this information in order to get everything working the way it's intended to work. So, all right, Marty, why don't we dive straight in? Why don't you talk a little bit, if we go to the next slide, about the importance of the hip? So when we talk about that, why is it so important?
It's really hard to do anything in life without your hips working, right? Obviously for anyone that is standing, sitting, walking, and, anything you're trying to do in life, your hips hopefully are fully engaged in that process. And, or if you have any dysfunction, you're going to have dysfunction in almost every single movement you do. So that's why, the hips are such an important part of the body. Yes, they're great for elite power and performance. And yes, there's a lot of people that work on them for cosmetics. But when you look at just the pure function of human movement and the importance that they play in allowing you to live a hopefully healthy and long and prosperous life, having good hip function is going to keep you moving and grooving, your entire lifetime. And obviously when your hips are working well, you can be more active. You can do more and more of the things that we like to do. And I think sometimes people just kind of don't really understand the importance of true functioning hips.
Absolutely. And if you guys remember, Marty and I have done some webinars in the past, really kind of digging into the anterior pelvic tilt as well as the posterior pelvic tilt. And if you haven't checked those out, then I suggest maybe going back and visiting those as well, because, we did take a deep dive into those particular compensations. And so when we kind of look at this, in general, there are so many dysfunctions that can happen. And to your point, Marty, it's going to lead to low back pain if you're not careful. It will lead to impingement issues where people are saying, like, when I stand up, I get this sharp pain in my hip. And, some of those are just due to basic muscle imbalances that sometimes we overlook because we're so concerned about what's happening above and below the hips versus what's actually happening at the hip. And so I think that's kind of important to note. And, kind of brings us into, if we go to the next slide, Marty, I know this is kind of your wheelhouse. And so when we're talking about the anatomy and the function of the hip, I mean, we all know that it's a ball and socket joint, and it's the deepest ball and socket joint that we have. Because if you think about, the leg and the hip and and all the things that surround it, why don't you kind of go into the information a little bit deeper for us?
Sure. So, a lot of people have a better understanding of maybe the shoulder anatomy, and that you have all these degrees of freedom. And because of that, you lose some stability. Now, the hip is a ball and socket joint. So yes, it is a more unstable joint than other joints in the body. Now, the hip has bigger and stronger muscles around it, maybe has a little bit deeper of a socket. So you don't see as many dislocations in a hip that you would in a shoulder, because people falling on their outstretched arm, etc. But when you look at the structure of the joint, being a ball and socket, it's supposed to have a lot of degrees of freedom and movement, all three planes of motion. But when you restrict that motion, especially now, if you think about what's happening when we walk, we run, we do jump, our foot is stuck to the ground. So that's what we call a closed chain. So if there's a dysfunction in the foot and ankle, or if there's dysfunction in the hip, that hip now has to create motion somewhere else to provide, whatever we want to do, whether it's a walk, a run, a jump, etc. So it's really, really important to look at the hip similar to the shoulder, that we want that ball and socket to be centered properly. And Wendy already talked about what would happen if we had an anterior tilt. We covered that in a posterior tilt. So if you have an anterior tilt or posterior pelvic tilt, the odds of the head of your femur being centered properly in that joint are just going to be statistically less. Then if we're not working on the range of motion in all three planes that you would see at a ball and socket joint, if you lack some mobility, which we'll talk about as we go through all 3 weeks here, we're going to talk about really especially hip internal rotation. And these muscles can't stabilize or keep your body centered and or perform their function, you're going to end up with some type of issue, right? It's inevitable, whether it's, anterior hip pain, whether it's a bursitis, whether it's sciatic pain, or if your hip is just dysfunctional enough that all of a sudden the pain ends up in your low back or your knee. A lot of times the hip is the problem, but it's not where the pain is. And we start to isolate and treat other things without really looking at the integrated functioning of the hip. So that's why it is just such a crucial joint. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes often overlooked, in my opinion.
Oh, I agree. And, we often say too that, the hip and the ankle pretty much dictate what happens at the knee. And so, that's one of the reasons when we always, and we'll go into this obviously in more detail, but when you're looking at the assessments, if you see compensations only at the hip and not at the foot, and I shouldn't say only at the hip, but in the knee and the hip, then oftentimes, because the knee kind of follows what the hip does, then there's a lot of dysfunction at the hip, which can lead to some major injuries at the knee complex, especially along with even your shoulder. Because you think about if you have an anterior pelvic tilt, which just means again that you're arching your back because that's your hip flexors are so tight, and the amount of compression in the lower back, that's going to affect the lat length that could also affect the shoulder. And so when we really talk about the kinetic chain and why we really focus on the 5 kinetic chain checkpoints and proper alignment, that one thing, no matter if it's at the foot and ankle, no matter if it's at the hip, it can lead to so many major things happening at other joints. And that's why when people just specialize, if they're having issues in their shoulder and they're only work on their shoulder and it's not getting better, they're really kind of missing that it's starting at the hips and causing that shoulder pain. And so hopefully by the time we're done with the 3-part series, you guys feel well informed on all the stuff that we're going to talk about, and maybe kind of hopefully set off some light bulbs of make sure that you check this out too if you notice some of these other compensations are occurring.
Yeah. And Wendy, that I have to go off script every so often, because when you say
that's okay.
But you're used to it. And that's why we stick with this. We work together every week. You can handle me just like having this light bulb moment. But, the key thing I think about the hip complex is for years, it was kind of not thought about. But now when you go in the gym, you see everybody loading up the bar, crawling under the bar, doing their hip thrusts. And that's awesome. People have gotten now to understand that you got to train the glutes, and you see all these cool exercises. We will talk about the execution of those at some later point, maybe when we get to program design. But the biggest issue I see right now is everyone's going for how much weight can they move. Mm-hmm. And when you look at these little muscles that are in that joint underneath the glutes, again, I always use that phrase, we have to earn the right to get to that point. And I think one of the biggest mistakes we're making in the industry right now is we've gotten so in love with glute training that it's all about power and intensity, but the function of the hip is not there. So now you take a hip that doesn't have good internal rotation, doesn't have good hip extension, doesn't have the stability of the pelvis, and now we're loading it up. We used to load it up just with squats back in the day, but now we load it up all kinds of ways. And now we're doing frontal plane stuff. And I'm just watching people in the gym. I'm like, I see the effort, I see the idea, but boy, oh boy, they're going about it wrong. So if there's gonna be a lot of things we really hope that you get out of this, but let's really look at the hip as, is it stable? Is it doing what it needs to do? Does it have the right range of motion? And then let's work towards the strength and power component. Yes, that's great to be able to look in the mirror and see the glutes. But the other thing that I see a lot is people confuse glute hypertrophy with good glute function. You could have great hypertrophy and still be a biomechanical mess. You're just, you can move a lot of weight dysfunctionally. And so a lot of people think that their glutes are dialed in because they've been able to make them stronger and have hypertrophy. But if you and I assess them, they still would have faulty movement patterns. But now they can just do it at a heavier load, which actually scares me more sometimes than if they do it you couldn't do it with that type of load.
Right. And I think you make a great point. I mean, there's books out there about, hip thrusts and stuff. And of course, Marty's read them, I've read them. And I think the concept is fantastic because, to your point, it is your powerhouse. If you can get them stronger and everything is working optimally, it's fantastic. However, if someone has a compensation and you do load it, then where are you really getting that strength from? And I think that's kind of what Marty just stressed actually is if you don't have optimal alignment at the hip and you start loading it very heavy, then, and you don't have, let's say, proper link tension relationship in the hip, then you're going to end up really causing more issues long-term that can lead to severe low back pain and and a lot of other issues along the way. But when we're talking about the hip, go ahead.
I was just saying, we have to remember, and I grew up in the powerlifting days, and I still struggle with some of this, that the stronger you get, the harder it is to correct those motions eventually when you are ready to correct those, because you've just really locked yourself into those movement patterns because you've gotten so strong. So, let's kind of take a step and make sure that we're moving well before we move under that type of load.
Absolutely. And so when we talk about the hip, what we're talking about, when you think about what is the hip made of, you've got your femur, which obviously is your big bone in your leg, and then you have your pelvis. And when you're looking at your pelvis, there are different parts of it. You've got your ilium, your ischium, and your pubis. And so when we're talking about the hip, we're literally talking about these particular areas of what we're focusing on. And because of that, there are so many muscles that attach to these specific areas within the hip that, obviously because of the ball and socket of abduction, adduction, flexion, extension, you're able to move in circles where if it's a hinge joint, it would just be forward and back with slight different movements throughout. And so again, think about what you're trying to achieve. And when we do get to the program design, think about how you can train all of the different muscles, because it really can affect what's happening on those particular, parts of the bone itself.
Yeah. And I think something else to add in there, because, you really touch on something, is when we're looking at the multiple planes of motion, and I always say that accidental exercise, and that's the beauty of the model, is there's more to it than most people would think, is we're not going to really get into the soft tissue, or the structures, right? We're not going to get into the hip caps and all that. But when we get people working through different planes of motion, right, the proper way, you're keeping those structures pliable and or the right extensibility and or strength that they need as well too. So that's why it's so important to not just do sagittal plane exercise under heavy load. It's, can they do a really well walking lunge where they do that thoracic rotation over top of the lead leg. So they're getting that internal rotation. Even one of the ones that I like to do a lot of times, and we'll get in this program design if we want, is, the active calf stretch, which, my knees flexed to 90 degrees and I'm rotating. And most people think I'm stretching my calf on the stance leg, but what am I doing at the hip, right? I'm flossing that hip in a sense and getting that glide. So that way I also have that rotation. So that's why the hip is so important, is we got to move in multiple planes, and definitely don't want to load them all, the heavy in multiple planes, but we really want to have that control and function throughout the frontal and transverse plane.
Right. And training the stabilizers are going to be key in order to make the prime movers work the way that they're supposed to work. And so, going through some of just basic hip movements, sometimes we take for granted. Back in the day, everyone was doing the fire hydrants. It's like, okay, if you do those right, is it a bad muscle or a bad exercise? And the answer is no, because it can be very, very beneficial. It's just, are you executing it correctly? So, because if you've got a huge arch in your back, or you're hiking it, or, getting motion, like you said, throughout, your back versus your hip, that can actually lead to more problems. But,
yeah.
Go ahead.
And one thing I said, Wendy, as we get into the assessments, this is why I love traveling when you or Ken or whoever I get to travel with, is have someone watch you and watch your form and technique, because it is so hard to watch what's going on in your own lumbar spine when you're trying to work through these. So as Wendy's going to go here through the assessments, but I would challenge all of you personal trainers, on occasion, get another set of eyes on you, especially when you're looking at the hip, because sometimes you think you're doing it well and you're really compensating and you don't even know it.
I know where you're going with that. So just a little backstory. Marty, another Miller, which was Ken Miller, and I actually did a corrective exercise workshop just recently. And I was walking and Marty was behind me and he was like, "What is happening at your foot?" And I'm like, "I thought I was walking fantastic. I thought everything was great. But apparently I have a major compensation that, with all the travel and this being in front of the computer, I've neglected, because I've been focusing so much on some other things correctively in my upper body that I was neglecting my lower body." So he brought that to my attention. I appreciate that. And I mean, that's the beauty of working with people that are very intelligent, that can spot something out. But that also is an assessment. As we talked about, any movement, whether you're, that's a gait assessment. Marty was doing a gait assessment on me and I didn't even know it, which is when you get the best information, is when you're not trying to do it correctly. Because unfortunately, as trainers, we know what we're looking for. So if someone's analyzing me and I'm like, okay, I know my feet need to be straight, then I'm going to do my best to try to keep them straight. Now, we know oftentimes our clients aren't aware of what we're looking at, but sometimes when someone does assess you, it's very informative. So to Marty's point, it's, have someone do an assessment on you, because it's very helpful to help you long term, because again, you're supposed to be the epitome of like health and movement. And if you've got a major compensation that someone can see right off the bat, then are you really practicing what you preach? And so
promise I didn't bring that up. I forgot about that. I was thinking about when I was, hey, can you take a look at my shoulder? Because I can't, right? I couldn't do
I know
myself. And in all honesty, guys, I have an appointment tomorrow with a movement specialist, just because I'm like, hey, I need you to take a peek at something I can't see. So because you understand this and you teach it, every so often humble yourself in a very good way. Get your own assessment on video. Make sure somebody else assesses you, just so that way it's a great learning opportunity. But like I said, I'm obsessed with trying to get to that perfect movement. I don't know if it's going to happen, but we're going to work towards it.
Hey, me too. Next time you see me, I'm really going to work on the lower body. That's my goal. So, but again, when we talk about assessments, we often talk about the transitional, which obviously you can see right there, but look at from the beginning, look at how someone's walking up to you. That's always important. Look at how someone is standing when they're talking to you. Are they, leaning to one side, like what I call cocking a hip? Because that may lead to an asymmetrical weight shift that you may see during the overhead squat. Once again, take off the shoes, set them up in the proper 5 kinetic chain checkpoints. Hands go over their head, so ideal alignment before you have them start. Show, tell, do. So once again, you're having them line up. You're going to have them do 5 squats from the anterior view, the lateral view, and if you want from the posterior view, again, up to you of what you're comfortable with and how you're comfortable your client is from you being behind. And then, based on those results, that may be enough. But if you're really unsure, like you notice that the knees are bowing out, that is really an uncommon compensation that people don't realize is uncommon because they're starting to see it more and more. However, if you have someone that their feet are straight, but their knees are bowing out, then do a single leg squat assessment or even our new split squat and see what happens, because a majority of the time, never always, but a majority of the time, unless someone is quote made that way and really bow-legged, then the knee will often cave in when they're on one foot or they're in a narrower stance. And so just to reiterate things that we've said in the past, it's important to take the single leg squat lower body results over your two-legged overhead squat if they are different. And then of course you're going to maintain what you're seeing obviously in the upper body with the overhead squat, and then design your program. And so as you see under, that's your transitional, which are the movement ones that we've discussed. And I'm bringing this back up next with the goniometric assessments. And NASM now has the mobility assessments that we're going to talk about. But those of us that have been trainers for many years have maybe become very accustomed to using a goniometer, which is basically what I call a human protractor. And when you're assessing someone and you're not sure if the compensation is occurring because of weaknesses of a muscle, but maybe a restricted joint due to the overactivity of a muscle, then if you take measurements of specific joints and it's ideal, then it's a weaker muscle. If you take a movement or you take a measurement of a joint and it is quote locked up or not ideal, then probably it's the overactivity that led to that. So you really want to focus more on the foam rolling and stretching. However, when we talk about the hip, you can see these are all the specific areas that you would want to focus on, which takes a lot of time. However, when you're looking at hip flexion, ideally you want anywhere from 0 to 25 degrees. If you have that, fantastic. Hip extension, a lot of people are restricted in hip extension. Or when they're working out and you're having them perform exercises, they're going way beyond 15 degrees. And if you have them go, let's say, do a cable hip extension and you have them kick their leg back very far, just realize they should have 15 degrees. Anything beyond that, they're probably going to start using their lower back, which is not what you want. You really want to focus on the glutes. Internal and external rotation, Marty just mentioned the importance of that, and we're going to go into more detail of why. But ultimately, we want about 45 degrees of dorsiflexion. Wow. 45 degrees of, yeah, that would be amazing. Again, dorsiflexion is 25 degrees, but internal and external rotation is 45 degrees, as well as hip abduction and adduction. And so that's if you want to use a goni. We know that most people don't. And if you want to obviously practice using a goniometer, I always call it a goni, but a goniometer, feel free to get used to it, but it does take time and practice to realize what number you're reading and all that. And so just so you know, these are ideal position or degrees of motion that you want to have. And we understand, because most people aren't familiar with this, that if you look into our new CES, the CES now has taken the goniometric assessment component out and has now actually brought in the mobility assessments, where you don't need a goniometer. All you need now is to visually look at someone to see if they quote pass or fail based on their ability to get to a certain range of motion. So if we go to the next slide, you're going to see a little bit more of what we're talking about. And Marty, I don't know if you want to kind of take us through some of the mobility stuff.
Yeah, and the beauty of these is that they're very simple. And when you're looking at these, it's not so, how do I want to say, like therapeutic when you're bringing out the goniometric, things like that in a fitness center. We're here, you're just looking at ranges of motion. So it's a little less intimidating for some of your clients potentially. The key thing is when we're doing the assessments, be able to tell, show, do. And again, if something doesn't look right, we always say this in our live workshops, don't make a big deal of it. Don't be like, oh my God, I've never seen, just take
How do
notes.
you move how do you get out of bed every day?
Or the one thing is like, I'd never call like, hey, Wendy, come over here. Have you ever seen, all right? Like, just, let's put that out there for a sake of conversation, because people are going to be, that no one wants to fail anything, right? So this is just the information you need. But what you'll see here at the top is kind of like a windshield wiper in a sense, right? This is the internal rotation test is what you're seeing there. So she's laying prone, and then you just passively, with your knees bent to 90 degrees, let your legs just naturally fall with gravity. And what you're looking for is, if you're seeing like a 90 degrees, they should have their leg at that 45-degree mark. We're not worried if it's 41, 46, 38. If they're closer to 45, the better, right? Now, on occasion, you may find people that have too much mobility, and Wendy had kind of mentioned about that in another slide here. That is also a problem, but what we're looking for here is if they have a lack of range of motion, then we know we need to work on the inhibit and lengthen. If they have too much motion, they're going to need a lot of stability exercises to control that motion. So most people will have issues, especially men, I'm going to say, with hip internal rotation. And when we get into squatting techniques and all that, that comes into play a lot. Then, the modified Thomas test is a wonderful test. It clears up a lot of things. So if you have one of the massage type tables, you can see she just sits on the table. So basically the base of your pelvis sacrum is there. You lean back, tuck one knee to your chest, and just letting gravity naturally let your opposite leg fall. So if this was her, and, let's say she's not holding in that position on her right leg, you would see that her hip flexors are tight and her rectus femoris is tight because her knee hasn't really fallen past the 90 degrees, but her psoas is really tight because her knee should be more parallel with the table. But also, when you're in a three-dimensional setting, if her knee abducts, I would know the TFL is overactive. So you could be one or all of those. So just a real easy, very simple test so you can hone in on the more specific stretching that you need. Then here you'll see also the lumbar flexion we put in here. Can you just very easily and gracefully go down to the ground and touch your toes? If not, it's a couple different things. It could be the way your pelvis sits, which is mine. It could be hamstring and or lats as well. So again, just a nice, easy screening technique to start to gather more information. And then again, this is always good for a retest after a couple weeks, after you've put together a program, or even right after you do your soft tissue work, you can retest to see if they're improving even slightly in these. So very easy to do.
And I think, these new mobility assessments, I love them because they take no time, and all it's doing. And I kind of want to reiterate the importance of mobility assessments is because it gives you a lot of information, and it actually confirms what you're seeing in the transitional assessments. And so it's just a quick hit of, okay, you know what, she can get into 45 degrees well, I should say she can actually go into the windshield wipers to where it looks like she's around 45 degrees on internal rotation. So it's not a joint quote restriction, it's a muscle thing. So all you're doing is looking and saying, yep, nope, yep, super simple. And you take those notes. And if somebody can't touch their toes, you just put fail. And that's the beauty of the new CES. And I really like how they've laid it out. They have done a great job showing you, hey, this is how you perform it. This is what you're looking for. And if they cannot do it without compensation, then it's a fail. Again, you're not telling your client, well, you failed that, but you're just saying, okay, that's great. Now I want you to move on. I want you to get on the table and let's perform a Thomas test. This is all I want you to do. And you don't have to call it that. I want you to actually do this for me. I just want to see how your body reacts in this position. So as Marty said, your terminology and the way you explain it to a client, you're just letting them know that you're just gathering more information. But the whole purpose of the mobility assessment is to help you determine the best route when you're designing a program on what do you need to look at in order to design the best program to get them out of whatever compensation you noted.
Yep. And again, these are, don't have to be all done the same day, right? Because, some clients want to get right in and get after it. We understand that, but you want to be able to run your clients through these in a fairly short period of time when you get to know them. So that way you can make the best program. And the cool thing about the mobility assessments, rather than going to metric measurement, is you can almost do some of this almost as a passive warm up as well. So people really, don't even know that you're truly assessing them. So there's a lot of cool things you can do with it.
Yes. And you, especially on, to me, the one that you're showing here with the hip internal rotation, it is not uncommon that one side will fall out to 45 degrees and the other one may not. So just
you seen
because,
that before, Wendy?
unfortunately, I have, and I see it more often than not. So if that's the case, you're going to say like right leg fail, left leg pass. And so if there's anything that you notice that isn't ideal on both sides, or there's something that's asymmetrical, please write that down because it's going to help you in your program design.
Awesome.
Yeah. So if we move on to the next slide and we discuss the, Marty, I get this question all the time, and I know that you're going to give us a fantastic answer. So
Okay.
I'm gonna pose we're gonna hope, right? I'm gonna pose the question, and I'm sure I'm gonna piggyback off of this, but you've got all of this information, right? You've got somebody that comes to you, and when they're statically standing and they're just talking to you, their feet may be out. You notice they have an arch in their back, their shoulders are rounded, their head's forward, but then you put them into the overhead squat. They take off their shoes. You may see some of the same compensations: feet out, knees in, anterior tilt, shoulders rounded, arms forward, which people are like, man, that's everything. But in all reality, very commonly seen, especially when now we're getting out now more after being on lockdown with the pandemic. And then we're looking at the mobility assessments, and we notice that some are pass and some are fail. So you have all of this information. Like what do you do with it? Because it seems like everything is messed up. And then, is it the hip? Is it the feet? Is it the shoulders? Like, what do you do?
Usually I call you, right?
I knew you were going to provide a great information.
Is that a great answer?
Yeah, I'll help you.
Yeah. So in theory, I'm going to start with a perfect world scenario where somebody's like, hey, whatever you want me to do training wise, I'm here. That's cool. I don't have any expectations of what my workouts have to be like. Just let's start the process. So the one part we didn't really mention is we also have the modified assessments to where I can start to focus on, is it more hip and or foot and ankle or hip? So of course I like to do the heels elevated overhead squat, because if everything starts to clean up, then if I had to pick a priority, like I try to get to everything and sneak it in right over time, I always want to know what's my biggest issue. So I try to look at the biggest. Now, the biggest issue you can identify that a couple different ways. Have they had pain or discomfort, or are they coming off a previous injury that they've been cleared to work with you now, but maybe they still have movement dysfunction? What do they do each and every day where it could feed into that same poor posture, right? If they sit all day, I know I'm going to have to address a lot at the lumbopelvic hip complex. If they're wearing high heels, elevated heels, I may have to address that and or attack the foot and ankle more. So those are some of the things that you can look at. But then I go through, when I look at their static posture, then when I look at transitional, as Wendy said, so we'll reiterate this. If I see a faulty movement pattern while they're squatting, their feet turning out, yes, you can use all parts of the corrective exercise continuum of inhibit, lengthen, activate, integrate. But when you add in the mobility assessments, let's say someone's feet turn out, but when you did the mobility, they had the right amount of dorsiflexion. Or if you had them do there's other assessments we didn't always put in here. So this is why it's important for you guys to dig through your material and take the course, is let's say I have the right extension of the knee. Well, wait a minute. Those would be the muscles that are overactive, causing the knees turn out potentially. We could still address the hip. But if all of a sudden they pass that with their mobility, but transitionally when they squat, I saw it. Well, yeah, I'm still going to address the inhibit and lengthen, but maybe I need to spend a little more time on the activate and integrate. And I'm going to be honest with you, I fell into this myself. As Wendy knows, I've been working on my ankle dorsiflexion for a lot. And I can't assess my own ankle dorsiflexion, so I can only kind of see what happens when I squat. So I was at our mentor, Mike Clark. So I said, hey, take a peek at my ankle. He measured it and it was 15 degrees. Not ideal, but definitely not what I would have thought. I was in the 10 or below because of what I saw in my squat. And guess what? I'm like, you know what? I've been doing a lot of soft tissue work. I've been doing a lot of static stretching. What I neglected was probably overloading, in a sense, appropriately, of course, but spending more time on anterior tib, medial gastroc, and posterior tib. And I'm like, dang it. I just kind of assumed that if I did the soft tissue work and the stretching, right? Because again, we already talked about why it's so important to have somebody else help you along with your program. So this is where you can really now become that detective, and don't get overwhelmed with it. It's truly should make the process easier because we've given you another tool. If we didn't give you this tool, it could be more frustrating because you just keep using the entire part of it and thinking that it's going to change it. So again, I'll reiterate it again from the transitional. Let's use a different movement. Well, let's use the same movement compensation. My feet turn out. Yes, it could be the calf complex is overactive. The short head of the bicep femoris is overactive. We're going to stay more around the foot and ankle and the knee. But they pass the weight-bearing lunge mobility assessment. They pass also the knee extension mobility assessment. But yet you would think that those muscles are overactive, causing that. So maybe we need to shift our focus more on what allows it, and we'd have to strengthen the anterior tib, the posterior tib, the medial hamstring, medial gastroc. So you may have to do all four, right? You may have to do all four parts of that technique, where if somebody is restricted in the mobility and has poor transitional, you have to do all four. But hopefully now we've added this extra tool to make it a little more specific once you understand the differentiation. So I know there's more material behind it, but in theory, it should actually make your program design even a little bit easier. So Wendy, I hope.
No, I mean, I think you pretty much nailed it. And the big key
part or the other part?
Well, I don't know. I don't know how much time I have for that, but I think that the key takeaway that we're trying to really hone in on this part is don't get overwhelmed. Just gather the information first and choose the assessments that you think are going to be safe for your client. So on the transitional side, if you know that their knees were caving way in, it's not safe for them necessarily to do a single leg. However, maybe they could do the split squat, which is now kind of more of a lunge, if you will, with a narrower base of support, and see if that confirms it. If you don't feel comfortable and think that that could also be detrimental, then just take the overhead squat and go off of that information, because you don't have to do too much. However, at that point, if you're like, okay, the knee's happening here, you did the modified squat, you know that it's really not the ankle, but you want to confirm that it's at the hip, then do the modified Thomas test that we just showed you. And if the leg can't get down to the parallel of, of the actual, table or whatever you have them laying on, or to Marty's point, like they can't bend their knee, it just is more comfortable being almost straight. It's a hip flexor, quads are tight. There's multiple things happening that should be your aha moment. Like, okay, I know that I need to focus on loosening these up. And it's just really, I think, super helpful. And it's just another tool in your toolbox just to help design that program, because there's nothing more frustrating than you feel like, man, I need to foam roll 7 different things based on what I saw. I need to, go and stretch these 7 things. And now I need to think about, okay, those were the 7 things I had to stretch. I got to strengthen the other 7 things that allowed that. Just shorten it up a little bit, confirm what is most important, focus on that first, and then we'll go on. So that's why we wanted to take this as a 3-series, basically a 3-series webinar, 3 series part. Yeah, whatever. We're doing this over three weeks is because it can be very complex, because there's so many things that could show up as a compensation that really hones in on the hip having dysfunction. And we wanted to show you guys, here's an easy way to program. Here's some ways to think about fixing these compensations and dysfunctions, and trying to help you be even more successful without stress.
And once again, you made a light bulb go off my head. When I'm out on the coffee talks or when we're doing our workshops, a lot of people, I don't want to say get frustrated, but maybe think that this is too complex. And we're like, oh, no, it's very simple. Because we know we don't have to do every single technique, because we have learned through the years on how to filter and navigate and wiggle and be like, nope, it's this, not that. So I was just thinking, and maybe people will put it in the comments, we've got a couple other cool series coming up, Wendy, but we're always looking ahead. Maybe we could talk about a couple different compensations and do a see this, do that, and kind of split it up to where people are like, oh, okay, I didn't need to do all that, because with this mobility assessment, it ruled out this. So maybe that could be a series that we do. I'm just saying,
Yeah, if you guys like that, let us know. But I think that one thing too, before we move on, I just want to also point out, because it made me think of this too. If you guys are on the right track, you're going to start to see some of these compensations clean up. So you're going to know that if there is an overhead, an anterior pelvic tilt, meaning that the hips, go forward, or an excessive forward lean, the hip complex is going to be overactive. So if you start to get better alignment throughout the hips and strengthen the glutes, then you're probably going to see some of those compensations start to diminish. They may not be gone, but you know that you're on the right track. So we're trying to de-stress you, but there are a lot of moving pieces in the hip complex. And so that's why we wanted specifically to go through this. But if we move on to our next slide here, and shocker, Marty. I mean, why would we put this here? I know, right? This is probably a slide that lives with us literally every webinar, because guys, when you have when you have an assessment, if they have compensations, which unfortunately will be almost every single person you see, you're going to start them in phase 1. And every 4 to 6 weeks, you're going to reassess them and hopefully get them up to power where there's no compensations. The power output is going to increase, and they're going to feel better, move better, perform better, do everything in life better, because you've taken them through a systematic, progressive training protocol that's going to help them get to whatever goal they want safely as possible.
Yep. And the key thing is that this is, I think, one of the easiest ways for people to purchase personal training, in the sense that you do the assessment, you identify the movement compensations, you show that you have a system to progress them, and then you show them that you have a training philosophy that's going to get them where they want to be. So instead of just, hey, what do you want to train today? Which always drives me crazy.
Me too.
But we put in client's choice, which is okay, but we're not, we're talking about a little bit of the entire puzzle, where we have a roadmap for all your clients now. So it really, again, cleans things up, and it shows that you're on this path. And, again, we've talked in the past, so go back and look at some of their webinars, how, like, today was an example. I did all 3 phases today, and I finished with the little bit of power after I got myself moving well. So, it doesn't mean that you can't get there, but this is that beautiful periodized program for you to follow.
It is beautiful, isn't it? All right. So if we move on to the next slide, we want to, just kind of think, truly about what are the key takeaways. And
shocker.
I know, right? The big thing is the assessments are going to be key. So I have that as number 2, because if the assessments are key, then you're going to know what muscles you need to focus on the activation side to alleviate, to stop allowing those compensations to happen. And what muscles are causing those compensations are the ones that you're going to inhibit and stretch in order to get those little guys to stop pulling something out of whack where it doesn't belong. And so when we say know the muscles and joints, as you saw, Marty and I were kind of talking, okay, here in general is what you need to know. I mean, you've got your abductors, your adductors, what are those complexes? Your hip flexor complex, your quads, there's 4 muscles in your quads, your hamstrings, everything is obviously going to be all connected. And then of course you've got things happening at the mid to lower back. So it's not the specifics of origin and insertion. However, you need to know the function of what these muscles do in order to properly design a program, because if you understand that and then you look at your solutions table, you're still going to focus on the faulty movement patterns, and that solutions table will say, if you see this compensation, guys, foam roll this, stretch this, and activate that, and then it's going to help with that one particular compensation.
Absolutely. And whether this is the hip, whether we go into foot and ankle, you're going to see this is the process that we go through. Just got to, have a plan, know what you're doing based off an assessment. And if you're working to improve human movement, then you go through the phases. It's kind of that simple.
Yes. We try to make it simple. That's what we're hoping. We're trying to simplify your life. Oh, well, we're hoping that you guys actually join us, next week too, because next week we're going to be talking about the same thing, the hip complex, but in movement in sport and in our everyday life. And so that's what we have on the docket for next week. And I really think it kind of puts in perspective, how do we move past the compensations of the hip, and what are you commonly going to see, and how do we work on fixing that?
Excellent.
Yes. Well, Marty, before we end, I'm going to go ahead and step in here. So if we go to the next slide, you guys are going to see my contact information. As always, you guys can email me with any questions, or if you guys have ideas. I mean, we got some great feedback on the Facebook page and in our chats that kind of trigger us to say, okay, people are asking a lot about the hip. Marty, let's do something on the hip. And somebody's asked us for some things coming up in the future. We really do take your feedback into consideration and want to try to, produce these that are going to be beneficial to whatever your needs are. So feel free to email myself if you want. It's at wendy.bats@nasm.org, or you can always find me on Instagram at wendy.bats13.
And then my contact information is there as well. You see my email, my Instagram, dr.martymiller72. If you want Wendy's cell phone number so you can call her like I do, just email me, and I'll be like, I have no idea where you got that from. So
remember, it takes two.
Good point.
Perfect.
Awesome, everybody. Well, thank you guys so much. And we look forward to seeing you next week on our second part of this 3-part series.